Now we're going to go to Ali Morris and Sarah Tanburn. They're both from Wales. Ali Morris is a feminist activist and campaigner, specialist violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence trainer and consultant. She's a member of Mafid Cymru. And Sarah Tanburn is a writer, activist, policy advisor, and co-founder of LGB Alliance Cymru. So thank you so much, and over to you.
We're from two organisations here in Wales, but the two work very closely. We're going to say a bit about that. What we're going to do is cover these 5 headings, a bit about the background and how we got here. And as we've heard from others, the eradication of the boundaries and rights and safety of women and of LGB people. We've been really busy over the last few months, and including some very rapid responses to bits of policy and events. We wanted to say a bit about what we've learned so far and how we're building our campaigning and how, therefore, we came into being. And then finally, a few thoughts on what we're going to do next. So as a little bit of context, Wales is quite a small country geographically, and in population terms, we only have 3.1 million population. Very importantly, to answer somebody's question in the chat, Wales is not England, and that might sound really obvious, but you'd be amazed how many people think that actually Wales is just a little bit of England. Because we have a devolved government, that means that quite a lot of things are decided in Cardiff, our capital, and not in London. And it thinks of itself as a socialist country, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And we have a small government. Our number of elected representatives is quite small per head. There are some important implications of those contextual facts. Who's in and who's not really matters here in Wales. Sometimes that's just presented as cronyism, but it does mean there are strengths in the fact that lots of people know each other and are closely connected, but there are also weaknesses. And if you're not at the table, if you don't know the right people, it's very difficult to then become part of the conversations. And being Wales, there are some additional risks to speaking out. And I think that other women have touched on a couple of those. If you're a lesbian, if you live in a rural country, in a rural part of the country, if you're a woman of colour, the issues of isolation, of losing your work and so on become increased because everybody knows who you are and what your views are. There's a big drive in Wales to be different, to separate ourselves from the English government in London, and because of seeing ourselves as socialist, to very strongly differentiate ourselves from the Conservative government at Westminster, and that we'll also talk a little bit about that. That difference is going to drive gender extremism here in Wales, and therefore matters quite a lot, because gender issues have become so aligned with being progressive that it's quite difficult to disentangle them, and that really matters. And one of those issues is that at the moment, education, health, policing, things that really matter to us as women and as lesbians, gays and bisexuals who care about the reality of sex, they're all devolved to Cardiff, to Wales, and to our government. The big framework of equalities in the United Kingdom, which is the Equality Act 2010, on which the sex-based rights of women are founded and coded, that is not devolved, but there is a big drive to see that devolved into Wales in this new Senedd. And because the Senedd, our Welsh Parliament, is called the Senedd, is small, there's relatively little scrutiny and debate of legislation. And what that helps is this problem that other people have talked about of massive institutional capture, that certain organizations promoting gender identity, promoting gender over sex, are being treated almost as part of government. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So we see a real problem that they're being treated as consultants, and we find it very difficult to get them to think about different views from women and from lesbians, gays and bisexual people.
Wales has a long history of political and community activism, where during times of hardship, women have actually played a vital role in showing support, whatever that cause is. So women have led the way for direct action in many of the campaigns, including Welsh language campaigns, political campaigns, and other things. So some of the key events that we have seen women involved in have been Green and Common, for example. So while in 1981, a group of women and children set off from Cardiff to walk the 120 miles to the airbase to fight for peace in the shadow of the nuclear arms race, they ended up setting up camp at the airbase for nearly 20 years. But the first ever female anti-war protest took place nearly 100 years ago in 1923. So when the miners' strike took place in 1984 to 1985, women protested alongside their husbands and their fathers and were key to setting up the soup kitchens and the fundraising events that maintained the families and the communities throughout that strike. And we saw during this that gay and lesbian groups actually became great allies during that time. So as Sarah mentioned, the political landscape in Wales has historically been socialist, with Labour dominating the share of the vote since the 1920s. So what we find here in Wales is a general belief in trusting our socialist government and a disbelief in them working against their own people. In 2010, government data revealed that in England and Wales together, 300,000 women were sexually assaulted and 60,000 women were raped. So at that time, Wales had a network of rape crisis centres, helplines, women's centres, local groups that knew the women in their communities. But today, what we are seeing is that many of those services have now disappeared or forced to diversify to include men or men that identify as women. So there are increasing concerns over our loss of women-only space. This is especially concerning in terms of lesbian space. This is happening due to a combination of things. It could be funders withdrawing or limiting their funding due to not prioritising or recognising the value of women-only spaces. And also funders withdrawing their funding when women refuse to open up their spaces to men who identify as women. So in my own city, for example, we had one of only 2 women's centres in the whole of the country that served a huge geographical area and ran many classes and projects in a safe women-only space. It also served as the base for a regional lesbian group and a women's refugee project. The local council, who had paid our rent for over 40 years, refused to pay it any longer, as a new building for people experiencing violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence was due to open in the city. I was a long-standing trustee of that women's centre, but as part of my paid employment for the council, I was the one responsible for obtaining the original funding and setting up of the new building. This new building was only open to women who had experience of violence and abuse. So it couldn't be used as a general women-only space, or for events, or for campaigns, or for the well-established lesbian group. More importantly, the new building was open to all, male and female, so was no longer a women-only safe space. This to me was a devastating blow, but Welsh Government, who had funded the purchase of the building, had made this crystal clear. So during its first year, we saw over 600 women accessed the service, but only 3 men and no trans women. During the following 5 years, we only ever saw 8 men at the most per year and no trans women. So was the loss of a potential women-only space really worth it for that? So across Wales, we were seeing well-established women's groups being taken over by trans ideologies. Personally, after 12 years as a member of the board for a specialist women's sector organisation that ran refuges and other services in my city, I left due to my voice being constantly ignored and silenced. The organisation was too scared to refuse trans women due to their fear of losing their funding and of being seen as anti-trans. But what fears the women in the refuge had clearly didn't raise any concerns. So in 2018, this came to a head when a Women's Place UK was due to hold a meeting in Cardiff. Trans activists harassed the venue to the point that the meeting was subsequently cancelled. Another venue was found and the meeting went ahead. But what it showed was how the increasing aggression and abuse was actually curtailing the lives of women and imposing conditions on how they should think and behave. So the negative impact of gender ideology was becoming clearer with an increased awareness amongst the public and women in particular. So it was around this time that the UK government proposed a new Gender Recognition Act, which became the tipping point for many people watching all this unfold before their eyes. The Act would threaten the essential and core identity of women. Under the Act, anyone who felt that they were not the gender they'd acquired at birth could self-identify as the opposite gender. So this would allow for any person of male biological sex to self-identify as a woman. And from that point be recognised as such, recognised as a woman, not a trans woman. So this would have meant that trans women would have the right to access single-sex services in line with their newly acquired gender and be recognised as a woman in all aspects of life, including arenas where correct data collection and analysis is vital, such as health and the criminal justice system, for example. They would not be required to obtain a gender recognition certificate or have undergone any form of medical intervention for this to take place. The campaigning around this proposed act by grassroots women's groups and thousands of individual women literally saved our sex, as the Gender Recognition Act was eventually put on hold and didn't go ahead. But we were seeing a range of policies and toolkits being developed that talked about trans inclusivity. But in reality, what that meant was the exclusion of women and girls. Some of these included a trans inclusion school kit and Welsh Government's Trans Action Plan. Both advocated for self-ID, but neither undertook an equality impact assessment, which is a legal requirement to look at the impact on women and girls. So with the ever-growing fight and campaigning around this issue, all the usual channels were used to get our messages across. We wrote letters, we leafleted, we ran campaigns, and much, much more. Many women and groups had made political connections and had used these as far as they could go. So we had come to an impasse. Long-standing, well-known feminists who were instrumental in earlier campaigns in the 1970s and 1980s were now part of the political establishment, but were no longer allies and had also been captured by the trans ideology. So in Wales, we were in the position where the political landscape alongside major Welsh women's charities have been captured by what is now called Stonewall Law. So Stonewall are an LGBT plus lobbying organisation that now has its feet firmly in Welsh Government and hundreds more organisations, universities and public bodies. Although they're an LGBT group, what we are seeing of late is that they've become primarily a trans lobbying group, and they've become the consulting body on equality and diversity that Welsh public bodies and organisations approach, to the exclusion of all other groups, including ours, Merched Cymru. In essence, they've become the mouthpiece for Welsh Government, but they are so pervasive that their influence is now called Stonewall Law. So what we are seeing is the manipulation of public policy under a formula that they want the law around trans to be. They create policy around this ideal and then proclaim that this is in fact law of the land. They conflate sex with gender, which is now common practice, as others have mentioned earlier, and are vocal in the fact that they actually want to see sex abolished as a protected characteristic under equality law, to be replaced by gender. Stonewall have their Showcase Diversity Champion scheme, where organisations can sign up to this at a cost, of course, and then become another mouthpiece for their ill-conceived ideology. However, we have recently seen a number of high-profile cases where Stonewall has been challenged in court and where their version of equality law has been proven to be legally inaccurate. The extent of Stonewall capture is widespread and includes all areas of life. Welsh Government and others who rely on Stonewall as their equality experts and believe this ideology are in fact opening themselves up to a possible legal challenge and irreparable damage. So on International Women's Day last year, a number of local feminist groups put T-shirts bearing female slogans on statues throughout Wales. And it was at this point that there was a realisation that there needed to be a more formalised mechanism for women to come together and establish a more coordinated approach to activism. So where are we now? What happened? Well, that formal action group emerged as Merched Cymru, closely followed by the setting up of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Alliance Cymru. So setting up Merched Cymru has served two purposes. Firstly, to highlight fundamental problems as we see them. And secondly, we publicise that women in Wales will not sit back and do nothing while their sex is being eroded and women are a class, are erased. So we have a website with a range of resources, blogs and information. We have a Facebook page, which reached nearly 4,000 people during our election week campaign. And we have over 1,000 Twitter followers. So we've connected with other groups across the UK. And I'd really like to say a huge thank you at this point to LGB Alliance and for Women Scotland for all the help and support that they've given us, especially during our election campaign. We've taken part in consultations and campaigns around the Equality Act, the census, and of course the Welsh election. And we are continually holding politicians and organisations to account and informing them on issues such as conversion therapy. Then they have no defence to say that they didn't know what was happening. So who would have thought that after 100 years, after the suffragettes, we continue to have to assert our right to political and social freedoms? While sexism persists, single-sex spaces must be supported for those that need them. So who would argue that it wouldn't be reasonable for refugees and rape crisis centres to choose to be single-sex? Who would argue that the intimate care needs of older women, those with disabilities, shouldn't be whose care shouldn't be undertaken by a same-sex carer? Who would argue that groups set up around race, religion and belief shouldn't have the right to be single-sex for modesty and dignity? And who would argue that lesbians, who are by definition attracted to others of the same sex, shouldn't be afforded same-sex space? And I could go on and on. So I've spent my whole adult life fighting for the rights of women and girls. But who would have thought that we'd ever get to the point where we would have to fight for the very word that defines us, which is woman?
Thanks to the Stonewall capture that Ali's talked about, we've seen a lot of silencing. I'm just going to give an example of the online hustings that happened during the elections here 16 days ago and what happened in chat rooms. Just two examples among many. A lesbian who runs a small business in a male-dominated sector wanted to ask about women's employment. Another disclosed her experience as an FGM, a female genital mutilation survivor, asked about sex-based rights. Both of those women were thrown out of events which were being run by Quangos set up to support women in Wales without any further discussion. I should say that both LGB Alliance Cymru and Merched Cymru are furious about that, and a lot of complaints are now ongoing. But therefore, for both organisations and others, speaking out is really important, whether that's on social media, through events and networks, press coverage, answering policy consultations. Our core objective at the moment is to be at the table and not on the menu, as I've said here, because even that is proving difficult. As a result, gender critical positions defending the reality of sex are simply not being taken into account, particularly in the light of that institutional capture. But we are also building new alliances beyond the traditional alignments. So we're talking to Conservatives, which for many women campaigning for women's rights in Wales has not been an historic relationship. We're challenging big sections of the nationalist movement here in Wales, and hence building all these new relationships. Ali's mentioned our great new website at Merched Cymru, merchedcymru.wales. I'll be putting that up in a moment. At LGB Alliance Cymru, we make the most of that site and also the LGB Alliance UK website, rather than doubling up. And using all that and our membership, which is growing fast, we've been reviewing, for example, all the local authorities in Wales for their recognition of sex. And so we're creating an interactive map for our website so people can focus on their efforts. And we're picking our battles. We know, as gender critical activists in Wales, that we can't do everything, and we're really keen to choose our ground. So we're particularly interested in talking about education, the curriculum. We have a new curriculum coming in Wales, which is gender to the max, and school design, because of course we talk about toilets. We want to talk about health, which is very important to our members in LGB Alliance, around women-only provision, and about stopping the forcible transition of teenagers through affirmation. We're talking about sex-based legal rights, and we're talking about the action plan that the government has proposed to bring forward around LGBT issues. We could talk about lots of other things. Concussion in women's rugby, the language used in public health, and so on, but we want to win the battles we pick. So any women in Wales or beyond, any lesbians or gay men watching, we need people for all sorts of activities. And I would emphasise that we are very, very careful to protect the identity of our members. We do not expect anyone to put their heads above the parapet if they are in serious danger of damage as a result. So please sign up go to Merched Cymru Wales, sign up for the newsletter, and have a good look at the resources on lgballiance.org.uk. Follow us both on Twitter, we're both quite busy, and we do lots. Send us direct messages, get in touch. Merched Cymru has set up a donation system, and that will be live in the next week or so, and that's always welcome to help support the website, if nothing else. And as we've said here, make more noise. The more noise that we can make about this issue, the better. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr, and stay safe wherever you are.